Joseph Mengele, the notorious demon doctor of Auschwitz.
This is all that remains of one of the 4 gas chambers here. And right next to the gas chamber was Mengele's lab.
Here, he conducted barbaric experiments on innocent victims.
The fact that he experimented on children earns him an even deeper place in hell.
Once he was finished, he murdered his victims to further his twisted pseudoscience.
Mengele dissected the bodies and collected the eyes and sent them for research.
What so corrupted a medical doctor that he went down in history as the angel of death?
Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis. This is Hitler's Most Wanted. Joseph Mengele has become the poster boy for Nazi medical experiments. What is it about Mengele that makes him so notorious? Guy.
Mengele was not the only Nazi doctor carrying out this kind of work, quote unquote. And the reason why we think about him is because he got away with it.
A lot of the underlying ideas behind Mengele's experiments were in line with scientific thinking of the day on issues like race and eugenics. What was not in line with the scientific thinking of the day were the practices.
Well, there's no question that his work was unethical. But one of the things we need to consider is the distinction between the ethics of the science and the validity of the science. They're not the same thing. We can have very ethical science that is conducted poorly, and we can have scientific research that's conducted very well, but it's completely unethical. What we really need to consider is the extent to which Mengele's science is either ethical or valid, and it may be neither.
His job is supposed to be saving lives, yet he's carrying out some of the most horrific atrocities that the Nazis committed. What is it that allowed him to do that?
To answer the question, I'm starting my investigation in Gunsburg, the picturesque German town where he grew up.
There's obviously a kindergarten to our left because I can hear the kids.
Yeah, that's right. That's the building over there.
I've come to meet with historian Sven Keller to find out about Mengele's early life and how he became a Nazi.
This is a children's playground.
Yeah, the Ruth Mengele playground, actually.
So it's named after a member of the Mengele family?
Yeah, it's named after the wife of one of the brothers of Joseph Mengele. Locally, the Mengele family was always known for their largesse, for making social donations, like many well-to-do families.
Since the early 20th century, the Mengeles have been one of the most important benefactors in town, and several local landmarks bear the family name.
Is it just me, or is it really creepy that there's the Mengele name stamped onto this children's fort in a playground named after a member of the Mengele family, and Joseph Mengele carried out heinous experiments on children in Auschwitz?
Well, I'm actually with you there. What makes it especially creepy for me is that there's a Jewish woman from Auschwitz who suffered from experiments from Mengele. Mengele kept her from feeding her newborn child in order to see what would happen to the child, how long it could live until it starved. In the end, the Jewish woman thwarted Mengele by silently killing her own child at night. This Jewish woman bore the same name, Ruth, as Ruth Mengele. This connection, that's something I can't get out of my head.
It's absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
So obviously the Mengele family are a big deal in this town. Can you tell me a bit more about them?
this was a very respected family. They came up from nothing. They were like self-made men. That was something that people admired.
Joseph Mengele was born in 1911 into a conservative Catholic family. His father, Karl, ran a successful farm equipment company that grew to become the second largest employer in town.
And what was Joseph Mengele like as a kid? What do we know about him?
That's not so easy to answer. There are not very many sources. The people that grew up with him, they describe him as likable.
Was there anything that was happening in his childhood, anything that he was doing that sort of hinted at the horrific actions he would partake in later in his life?
Not at all.
None
I
at
would
all?
say, not at all, no.
So he was just a normal kid growing up in an affluent family in this nice town in Bavaria?
Yeah, that's what I would say, yeah.
Throughout Joseph's adolescence, the Mengele business continued to grow, as did the family's influence over the town. In the early 1930s, Hitler visited Gunsburg twice to drum up support for the party, even giving a speech at the Mengele factory on his second trip. By 1933, Karl Mengele had bribed his way onto the town council.
So this street is named after Joseph Mengele's father.
That's Joseph Mengele's father, yes.
I can't think of another notorious Nazi whose family name exists on a street sign. I mean, why wouldn't they just get rid of it now?
Yeah, this is this very complex relation the town has with this family.
Yeah.
With the family being so respected and giving donations, it was very hard for the city to get a distance. Me personally, I would get rid of the name.
As successful as the Mengeles were, Joseph chose not to follow in his father's footsteps.
How did Mengele get set on his path to become a doctor?
He graduated from high school in 1930, and he wasn't made for the family career. How that decision was made exactly, frankly, we don't know. But he went to Munich and started to study medicine.
Munich was the center of the Nazi movement during the 1930s. Once Hitler became chancellor in 1933, Jewish scholars and scientists were dismissed from the universities and replaced by Nazi sympathizers. These were the academics who taught and influenced Joseph Mengele.
Mengele was an incredibly hard-working young man, and when he was doing his degree, he also did a doctorate in anthropology.
In medicine, he wasn't so much interested in the clinical part of it.
Okay.
He went for this quite new, sparkling branch of medicine called genetics.
Okay.
And obviously, genetics and anthropology were both sciences that were pretty much connected to what National Socialism did with their racist theory.
Wow. So he was potentially radicalized while he was studying at university.
Yeah. It would be much easier if you could say, well, this was a madman from the beginning.
Yeah, but you can't.
Would be much easier, but you can't.
In 1937, Mengele took a coveted research assistant position at the Institute for Hereditary, Biology, and Racial Purity in Frankfurt. Here, he joined geneticists studying twins in a department at the forefront of Nazi racial programs.
It sounds to me as if these racial ideas are sort of mainstream academia in Germany at that time.
Yeah, mainstream, but also at the very kind of bleeding edge of academic research. He hoped this would be a career boost by concentrating on those sciences.
Mengele joined the Nazi Party in 1937, and his advancement in the medical profession paralleled his advancement through the Nazi ranks. In fact, in 1938, the same year that Mengele received his medical degree, he also joined the SS.
At that time, at the latest, he seems to have fully embraced the regime.
That regime would soon allow Mengele to commit some of the most despicable crimes of the Second World War.
Are those eyes?
Joseph Mengele. He dissected the bodies and collected the eyes for research. It's really disturbing.
I'm in the southern German town of Gunsburg with historian Sven Keller, tracing the origins of Joseph Mengele's sadistic pseudoscience.
What I actually wanted to show you is this memorial here. This is for the victims of Joseph Mengele.
This is, oh. Are those eyes?
Those are eyes, yes.
Because of Mengele's fascination with eye color, he ended up removing the eyes from many of his victims. And that's why the memorial to Mengele's victims that was erected in his hometown of Günzburg consists of many, many eyes.
In one particularly evil experiment, Mengele attempted to change eye pigmentation in 36 children. He injected them with colored dyes, causing excruciating pain and blindness. When it was all over, Mengele had no further use for the children and sent them to the gas chamber.
I like this memorial, and what I also like is that it was made by students from local high schools.
Really?
Yeah, they came up with this idea of using the eyes of Mengele's victims to get a connection to the person looking at this memorial, and at the same time address this history of the town, this part of their town's past. And I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah, amazing, especially getting kids to do it. So they're at a young age, they're learning about the history of Mengele and what he did.
Yeah, and learning about the victims and taking the perspective of the victims, yeah.
So what impact does it have on you to study someone like Mengele and to really analyze his life and his crimes?
We need to understand how people like Mengele became what they became, why they did what they did, and how it was all possible. Because if we don't understand why these people committed those crimes, it may happen again.
What kind of world would allow young doctors like Mengele to commit atrocious crimes? What opened the door to this gruesome, mad science? To find out, I'm headed to Berlin, the former scientific center of Nazi Germany.
Alexandra, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm meeting Dr. Alexandra Lovenau, a historian and expert on eugenics during the Third Reich.
The eugenics movement was all about destroying or eliminating mental diseases and not only mental diseases but also physical deformations.
Eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aim at improving the genetic composition of the human race. Today, this type of negative eugenics is obviously seen as quite repugnant.
In the 1930s, the Nazis turned to eugenics to help realize Hitler's dream of a master race. They started by weeding out so-called defective Germans. Less than 6 months after Hitler took power, any German who was disabled, mentally ill, or diagnosed with a hereditary disease was forced to undergo sterilization.
So about 400,000 people were sterilized. Mentally ill people were not allowed to reproduce, to have babies.
But preventing so-called worthless Germans from having children wasn't enough for the Führer.
Not only did the Nazis want to stop mentally and physically ill people from reproducing, they wanted to eliminate any need to spend resources on caring for them.
The Nazi government decided that it simply is too costly to keep them alive.
Therefore, they should be murdered.
Yes. They started with children below 3 years old.
Who was killing the children?
These were physicians.
Mengele is very much part of the kind of Nazi medical community, which actually thinks that anybody who is disabled or quote-unquote defective in some way should be put to death.
In 1939, Hitler ordered gas chambers added to 6 designated institutions. patients deemed unfit to live were sent there to be killed. It was a clandestine operation, later named Action T4.
However, it was basically impossible to keep it as a secret.
Hitler couldn't afford a public backlash during wartime. Action T4 was cancelled in August 1941, but the Nazis ordered physicians to continue the slaughter in a more concealed manner.
What brings someone who is in a profession that's supposed to heal people and save lives, what brings them to commit mass murder?
The majority of T4 Action physicians were relatively young, like Mengele. These are people who graduated in the mid-30s. Students were told not to waste your time, energy, and career on trying to help people who could not be helped, because they're not going to improve.
Right up until the end of the war, Nazi doctors murdered another 200,000 people.
This is totally chilling, because the idea that any human being who's not perfect in some way is regarded as being a drain upon the rest of humanity. And the idea that if you eliminate all these people, you either murder them or you sterilize them, that you're actually going to make humanity better is obviously completely evil, because it's not accepting the fact that human beings aren't perfect.
After the Reich's most vulnerable citizens were murdered by the very people sworn to look after them, Nazi physicians took their inhumanity a step further.
In some cases, it also happened that the researchers would visit killing centers and examine patients themselves, still living patients. And if they found someone interesting, the brain of that person would have been delivered.
You're saying they would select someone and say, you know, I want to examine that person's brain. And so that person was murdered in order for them to conduct experiments on their brain.
Yes. And in fact, it was seen as a great opportunity, a never-ending source of research material.
That's horrifying.
It is indeed, yeah. So that makes the Euthanasia Action even worse, and the involvement of researchers who were conducting scientific research on the brain makes them killers.
A lot of doctors were particularly enamored by the racial pseudoscience and phony ideology of the Nazi Party, because it blended in very well with a lot of kind of medical opinion at the time.
Mengele's scientific interests were never separate from the theories of racial science that were mainstream at the time, and specifically from Nazi ideas of racial hygiene.
This was the world Joseph Mengele stepped into as an aspiring young doctor. He would soon embrace the Nazis' inhumane ideology with a chilling zeal.
He had absolutely no human feelings towards these children.
I'm on a mission to figure out where the notorious doctor Joseph Mengele fits into Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I've come to the site of a former Nazi concentration camp at Sachsenhausen to meet someone who chose her career after coming across one of Mengele's victims.
Astrid?
Oh, James. Hi.
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. How are you doing?
Dr. Astrid Ley is a historian and deputy head of Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum.
So what was it that launched you into this field of study?
Actually, it was the encounter with a victim of Mengele's experiments that I had many years ago after I finished school. And for her, the most terrible thing was that she kind of didn't know how it affected her health. So I made it my goal to find out what the Nazi doctors did and tell it to the surviving victims.
Joseph Mengele is the name people most associate with medical experiments in Nazi concentration camps and death camps. But obviously he wasn't the only doctor
working in those places. How widespread was that practice?
It was a very widespread phenomenon. In all of the bigger camps, medical experimentation took place, and it started immediately after the Germans had begun the war.
The Nazis also encouraged medical experimentation to support the war effort.
Doctors were trying to cure injuries resulting from war by testing vaccines for infectious diseases that come up during the war, like hepatitis, like typhus.
The Führer offered up a deeply unsettling and vast new testing ground to unethical physicians like Joseph Mengele, looking to make medical history.
For doctors and for ambitious researchers, ethical constraints on using human subjects could sometimes be frustrating. The concentration camp system provided subjects that doctors were free to experiment on as much as they wanted.
What sorts of medical experiments were taking place here?
At that time, hepatitis was not known like we know today, being a viral infection. So one doctor, what he did is that he went to Auschwitz, he selected with Mengele 11 Jewish boys. The boys were transferred to Sachsenhausen.
The boys were infected with tissue biopsied from German soldiers suffering from hepatitis.
We do have testimonies of a prisoner's nurse, a male nurse, who was describing how the boys were crying, what extreme pain and how they were frightened. And the doctor didn't seem to care. These Polish Jewish boys, for him they were nothing better than guinea pigs.
During the war, a grisly array of medical experiments was conducted across 8 of the largest concentration camps.
How could a doctor whose job it is to care for people, how could they be so cruel?
Yeah, this is what we really don't understand. It shows an extreme ability to distance yourself from the suffering of your victim. And you can only do that when you don't consider this person being a human being.
Empathy is the ability to feel what another person is feeling. If you feel sad when you see another person sad, or you get scared when you see another person who's scared, that's empathy. It's quite clear the Nazis didn't feel empathy because they dehumanized their victims to such an extent that they didn't feel empathy for those people.
The appalling way in which these experiments were conducted ultimately did next to nothing to advance medical science, except in a small handful of isolated cases.
Today we know that hepatitis is a viral disease because of this experimentation.
That's really disturbing. So the medical experiments were both for helping soldiers on the front line, but also as part of justification for Nazi racial ideology.
Yeah, definitely.
Joseph Mengele would take this ideologically based research to another horrific level.
Mengele was interested in heredity. And at that time, a way to study heredity, to see which characteristics were environmental and which were inherited, was to look at twins.
And I'm guessing that twin research, was that something that was specific to Mengele, or was that something that was being done in the wider scientific field at that time?
It was something that was very acknowledged, and Mengele was, actually, he was not a nobody. He was one of the leading geneticists. In 1938, Mengele, in a book review he wrote about a twin study, he said, the biggest problem we have is that we can never dissect twins at the same time, because twin couples hardly ever die at the same time. So this is why he became a concentration camp physician. He went to Auschwitz because in Auschwitz he would have the chance of experimenting on testing, examining more twins, and he planned to later write about it, use it in order to make his scientific career.
To find out what exactly Joseph Mengele did to make his scientific career, I need to go to the place most synonymous with his cruel legacy.
He used to visit the children with some sweets. He was bringing just for them.
I'm on a mission to figure out where Dr. Joseph Mengele fits in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I've come to Poland to see the one place most closely associated with his sinister crimes.
Here we are at the entrance to Auschwitz-Birkenau. This camp is enormous. It sprawls as far as the eye can see.
Auschwitz is the most well-known Nazi concentration camp and a prevailing symbol of the Holocaust.
Right now we are in the main camp, so-called Stammlager, Auschwitz I,
Right.
which was actually the beginning of Auschwitz.
To learn exactly what role Joseph Mengele played in the horrific crimes committed here, I'm meeting with historian Teresa Wątosiewicz.
Before the war, the barracks were Polish army base, and in 1940, they became another German concentration camp.
Auschwitz ends up becoming one of the largest Nazi concentration camps. It's originally on one site, but it actually ends up going to 3 separate sites, which cover about kind of 8 miles in distance.
Joseph Mengele arrived in Auschwitz in May 1943. Why did he come here?
He was sent here after he kind of fulfilled his military duty as a doctor.
Mengele was an officer with the Medical Corps of the Waffen-SS, Hitler's most fanatical combat troops. He was wounded on the Eastern Front in 1942, and after recovery, requested a post to Auschwitz.
Joseph Mengele was one of quite a few doctors at Auschwitz. When the trains came into Auschwitz, it was the job of one of these SS doctors, including Joseph Mengele, to select the Jews as to who was going to go to the gas chambers and who was still fit enough to work. He literally was just going left, right, and whichever way you went determined whether you were going to be dead in a matter of minutes or whether you were going to live another day and maybe survive a few weeks until you were worked to death. So that was one of his primary roles. His other role was to use Auschwitz as an experimental laboratory to conduct his very twisted pseudoscience. Doctors like Mengele regarded a body of human people as essentially just that, a body. And if you could kind of excise the cancerous part of that body, i.e. the races you regard as being infectious, unclean, diseased, such as Jewish people, then you'd be doing the body itself a favor.
Here, they started to send families. They started to send children. So having families meant to have the twins and triplets together for the experimentation.
The exact purpose of Mengele's research on multiples is still unclear, but it's widely believed he spared twins from the gas chamber because he hoped to find in them the secrets to genetically engineering Hitler's master race.
At the time, the genetic code was not fully understood. He was actually undertaking some of the introductory research into hereditary studies with twins.
Twins were regarded as useful for this kind of research because you could look at 2 people with identical genetic material and see what was the same about them and what was different. And so you could conclude which characteristics were influenced by the environment and which were inherited.
Mengele had to first differentiate which features were replicated and which showed some variation. Only then could he try to eliminate undesirable and so-called racially impure traits.
He used to visit the Roma children in Birkenau with some toys, with some sweets. He was bringing just for them.
He used to give them toys and sweets.
He did. He did. This is how he was remembered.
So he would bring them toys and sweets, and then he would take them and carry out his experiments on them.
This is true.
Once the children were inside Mengele's laboratory, the torture began. Crude surgeries, painful tests, needless amputations, wounds deliberately infected, and exposure to fatal disease were all routine.
Mengele was completely devoid of human feeling while he was conducting experiments that he thought were in the name of scientific progress, but he didn't care that they were incredibly cruel and inflicted untold suffering on his victims.
Scores of Mengele's victims died before he even finished experimenting on them. Those who survived rarely fared better.
For the very last step, the children were killed. So this is what happened for most of the children.
So after they'd been experimented on by Mengele, they were killed, and then someone conducted an autopsy on their bodies.
This is correct.
Clearly, it requires utter sadism to carry out experiments, on living people, and indeed to kill them just to find something out. There's an appalling story in which Mengele and one of the other Auschwitz doctors are arguing about whether a child has got tuberculosis, and Mengele maintains that he has, and the other doctor maintains that he doesn't. Mengele comes back an hour later and confirms that Mengele was wrong, the child didn't have tuberculosis. How has he found that out? He's killed him and dissected him just for the purposes of a medical discussion.
The majority of twins at Auschwitz died from Joseph Mengele's experiments. Only a handful survived long enough to see the camp liberated by the Soviet army on January 27, 1945.
Like many people, I've read about this place. I've seen pictures and movies about it, but I didn't fully get the sheer scale and the extent of the suffering until I saw this place with my own eyes. It's something that I'll never forget.
Yet despite his sadistic crimes, the Nazi doctor from hell somehow slipped the net.
The fact that after the war he escaped, lived out his life, and there was no public reckoning is incredibly frustrating.
I'm in Berlin, meeting with historian Tobias Freimüller to find out what happened to Joseph Mengele as Hitler's empire was crumbling.
So this is a memorial established in the late 80s.
Right.
And it represents the deportations mainly to Auschwitz.
What happened to Mengele when the Red Army was coming towards Auschwitz?
He left shortly before, and then he would travel westwards disguised as a Wehrmacht officer.
In June 1945, American forces captured Mengele among some 10,000 German troops on the run in Saxony. They scanned the POWs for Waffen-SS tattoos, but when Mengele had joined the SS, he decided not to get one.
So he was released under a different name. He started working as a farmhand in southern Germany for quite a long time.
Then the world began to learn of the barbaric crimes committed by Nazi doctors.
All of the defendants herein unlawfully, willfully, and knowingly participated in plans and enterprises involving the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
There was actually a doctor's trial held in Nuremberg where doctors who had committed atrocities in the service of Nazism were put on trial.
Mengele knew he had to flee.
He hotfoots it down to Argentina, which is probably the most popular retirement destination for former Nazis.
Mengele lived under an alias for several years in Buenos Aires. Then in 1958, he married his brother's widow, a major shareholder in his father's company.
In order to do so, he needed his real name and his real passport and his real identity. And so he went to the German ambassador in Buenos Aires and got his German passport with his real name. You could find his name in the telephone book of Buenos Aires, and he lived there under his real name, yes.
And he obviously at that point wasn't frightened that
People were going to track him down.
Absolutely.
Nazi hunting was carried out by the Allies for about 3 to 4 years, and then they stopped doing it because they ran out of inclination and indeed the ability to launch tens of thousands of manhunts. You know, it would be taken decades.
And at what point did people start trying to track him down and bring him to justice?
In the late 50s, finally, there was a warrant of arrests issued out.
In 1960, Israel's intelligence service, the Mossad, captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires. They set out to capture Mengele during the same operation. Spooked, Mengele fled to Paraguay, but the Mossad stayed on his trail, so he slipped over the border into Brazil.
From that point on, his life became much less comfortable. He had to change his houses a couple of times.
For more than 3 decades, Mengele's relatives in Günzburg had been complicit in helping the Nazi fugitive. They provided financial aid and denied knowing his whereabouts. Only his son was willing to confront his father about his crimes.
And when his son visited him in the mid-70s, he asked him about Auschwitz and he asked him about what he did. And the son later reported that his father did not show any insight, that he would still say that it was correct what he did and it was right what he did, and that there's no need to apologize for anything. And that's why his son then traveled back to Germany and never get back to him.
Really? So his son was so horrified by his father's, not only his crimes, but the way he justified those crimes, that he cut off
exactly
communication with him.
And the father obviously had hoped that he could convince his son that he did the right thing back then.
And how did he die?
He had a stroke, but it took another 6 years until it was finally officially proved that it was him, that he was actually dead.
Mengele is only hunted properly in 1985, around the time of the 40th anniversary of the kind of end of Auschwitz, which was in January 45.
That's when German police raided the home of Mengele's childhood friend in Gunsburg and found evidence of the doctor's death.
What's ironic about, Mengele's ultimate fate is that when his bones are dug up at this graveyard at a place called Embu in 1985, his skull is held up and shown to the world's media. And those bones now have ended up in a lab, where they're looked at by medical students. It's kind of fitting that he doesn't have a proper grave. He ends up in a laboratory.
At what point did he become this notorious figure that epitomizes so much of the evil of the Nazi regime?
I think it's basically because he performed so terrible medical experiments, and it's easy to picture this. It's not so easy to picture what Eichmann did, but it's easy to see that doing medical deadly research on twins, on children, or deciding which Jew should sent directly into the gas chamber and who is not, is something completely and deeply inhuman. So this was a monster, a picture of a monster that he had escaped, made the whole story even more interesting.
Mengele was never known to express any remorse or take any responsibility for his crimes. The fact that after the war he escaped, lived out his life, and died from having a stroke while swimming is incredibly frustrating. There was no public reckoning. There was no chance for the victims and the survivors to testify and to put their story before the world and to see some measure of justice dealt out to Joseph Mengele.
Now that I know Joseph Mengele's key role in the inhumane medical experiments conducted in the service of the racist Nazi regime, it's time to figure out where he stacks up in Hitler's hierarchy.
Auschwitz offers an environment unlike any other, a place where a physician can experiment on human beings with no moral retribution at all.
After retracing the story of Joseph Mengele's murderous exploits through Germany and Poland, it's time for us to decide where this demon doctor fits in the hierarchy of evil. Using our unique system of playing cards, I want to determine where Joseph Mengele ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
There's so many horrific elements to Mengele's story, but one that really stuck with me is the stories about him doing selections on the ramp at Auschwitz.
Yes, I think it's also important to remember that Mengele is one of many doctors in many camps carrying out this sort of work. I use the word doctors with inverted commas because I think you've actually given up deserving to be called a medical person if what you're doing is slaughtering people, essentially.
With the flick of his wrist, Joseph Mengele held the power of life and death over so many innocent victims.
What led a physician from a wealthy and respectable family to carry out such horrific acts?
Mengele was incredibly ambitious, and he saw the work that he was doing at Auschwitz as having the potential to open doors for him for his future career. When he took that ambition and took the state of science and combined it with a complete lack of ethics and a lack of human feeling.
As well as ambition, he was motivated by a twisted form of anthropology. He really did think that certain types of people were inferior to certain other types of people. And that's what lay behind his research, and that's what led him ultimately to murder.
It's a terrible backwards ideology, but if you fit into that ideology and you believe it, you may in fact be capable of doing the horrific things that Mengele did.
Careerism and a warped racial worldview spurred Joseph Mengele on to commit unimaginable atrocities.
It seemed to me that Auschwitz really opened the door, that it gave an opportunity for Mengele to take things to another level and really cross that ethical boundary.
He simply had an opportunity. He had human bodies that he didn't care about and wasn't concerned about ethically and morally, and he was given the opportunity to do anything he wanted to them.
Auschwitz offers an environment unlike any other that's almost ever existed in the world, a place where a physician can experiment on human beings with no moral retribution at all.
It's important to remember when evaluating Mengele and his crimes that there were doctors, even Nazi doctors in concentration camps who refused to participate in these activities. He did it willingly.
Working in the appallingly cruel Nazi camp apparatus, Joseph Mengele saw himself above morality. His work was neither valid nor ethical. He coldly betrayed his Hippocratic oath, and what's worse, he was never held to account for his crimes.
What I'd like to do now is come to a conclusion as to where you think that Mengele should rank in the hierarchy of evil. Matt, let's start with you.
Well, as a scientist and a researcher, I'm particularly bothered by Mengele's research, his ideology, and his methods in particular. Regardless of his own outlook on his medicine, I have to rank him quite highly. I'm going to put him at 9.
Anthony.
If we were ranking based on cruelty, he'd be in the top 5. But we're ranking based on his centrality to the Nazi regime's atrocities. I'm not convinced that he was central. He was part of a system that spanned hospitals, universities, concentration and death camps. He was one among many. He's number 49.
Guy.
I'm going to score very differently to you, but almost identical reasons. I think that actually he is a symptom of an evil way of thinking. It was a way of thinking that actually we had to fight against, and it's actually partly why we went to war. His sadism and cruelty, of course, knows no bounds, but because I regard him as a symbol of all that was totally twisted about that way of thinking and about the regime, I am going to put him very high up, and I am going to put him at number 5.
So the three of you have very different perspectives. For me, it's very simple. We're talking about a hierarchy of evil, and I can't think of anything more evil than torturing and murdering children. So for me, he has to be in the top 10, and I agree with Matt here. He's number 9. He is the Queen of Spades.
Perhaps the most notorious Nazi fugitive of all, Joseph Mengele has become the embodiment of pure evil. A physician pledged to heal who kills instead. The diabolical doctor from Auschwitz is a central figure in Hitler's Most Wanted.